Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, logic, and Mill, John Stuart Mill, who was an influence on Lewis Carroll, and many others I'm going to give many talks about. So this is a talk on Mill logic gathering and dividing, which is particularly important for Alice in Wonderland, The Looking Glass, and specifically the sorts of sums the Queen asked Alice to do. My apologies for the construction noises outside. I am going to try to talk through things, and I only have a couple of days to make a bunch of videos, so they're still going to build the building next door. So I imagine through the next couple of days at least. So John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873, was educated by his father and Jeremy Bentham. Please see my video about their ethics. I have at least one, if not two, because there's two of them. To Jeremy Bentham, who's somewhat of a Benjamin Franklin-looking guy, without the glasses, was a family friend who, along with Mill's father, educated Mill, young Mill, to be a genius for progress and libertine thought. And he is one of the most influential libertine thinkers in British history. Obviously, being liberal, libertine, libertarian have different meanings left and right. But Mill and others outside of America would often associate libertine ideas with the left, but again, that's a mixed bag. So Mill was an early arguer for the abolition of slavery, women's liberation, individual rights, and freedom as the goal of modern enlightened society. He is known best and hated by some for utilitarianism, the ethical philosophy that what is best overall, what makes the most overall happiest for the longest amount of time, in fact, is what should be done regardless of tradition or previous prejudice as to what was rational or logical or best or based or what have you. Mill studied Greek, Latin, and French as a boy, and then studied logic, chemistry, and biology in France, where he met Henri Saint-Simon, the original socialist, who coined the term socialism. In the French, it looks to Americans like socialisme, but isn't. Who argued, Saint-Simon did, whose name is Saint-Simon Saint-Simon hyphenated as the whole last name, who argued, Saint-Simon, for meritocracy that benefited the working classes before Marx and Engels said that and much more, in fact they go past that specifically, in the name of communism, a more radical form of socialism, according to many. While Saint-Simon said society should be based on the maxim from each according to ability to each according to productivity, cutting off those on the top and bottom of society who do not contribute to the good of everyone. Marx and Engels went beyond this and argued the maxim should be from each according to ability to each according to need, regardless of output. That society, based on the premise that we create enough in industrial times, everyone can have enough, which is, all of this is debatable. His father wrote a history of India. Mill's father wrote a history of India, and Mill was for a time involved with his father in the British East India Company, the corporation that helped Britain maintain their economic hold over India. It was from Jeremy Bentham, whom Mill learned about Epicurus of ancient Greece, who taught that the goal of individual and social life was not morality, but happiness. Not rules, but that the end point of having any rules or tools is to be good and make people happy. Bentham called his philosophy consequentialism. I do mention a lot to people. Consequentialism, instrumentalism, and utilitarianism are often interchangeable, sometimes identified with pragmatism. Whatever works is essentially this. These are different or exactly the same philosophy depending on who's defining their terms how. I do tell my students consequentialism, instrumentalism, pragmatism, utilitarianism are all, well, rules and principles be danged. Heck, that it really is just best practice. Everything else goes by the wayside if it need be. So that, again, to folks who are more conservative or more moralistic is not so great because it is radical change to whatever, and it's all about the end state rather than conserving the means or practices. So in particular, it was Mill, however, after Bentham's consequentialism and learning from Bentham as a boy, that Mill found the word utilitarian, ironically enough, in a Christian text that used the term negatively. The more conservative author of the Christian moralistic text said that we need not be, quote, merely utilitarian. We should not be merely utilitarian, quote unquote, in our actions, following principles only when they lead to happiness and are good. We should just follow them even if they make us miserable and lead to the downfall of society, apparently, which Mill disagreed with. Mill applied this progressive model of thought that we can be utilitarian, perhaps not merely for him. He applied this to logic, mathematics, economics, and ethics. Now, for Lewis Carroll, it is very important that Mill is looking at logic not as so much rule-based, but practice-based and also human and emotion-based, and that we are doing rough sums of things with our thinking, which is very much... Lewis Carroll owned Mill's work, several books by Mill. He was looking at Mill's view of logic, and Mill's view of logic was controversial and talked about at the time as Lewis Carroll was studying logic. And Lewis Carroll looks like he is working with Mill, De Morgan, and Boole to understand what can be preserved and extended from Aristotle. Now, Boole and Mill and all these thinkers are very different, so I'm going to slowly work through this stuff in short videos. So in all subjects, Mill advocated rethinking basic principles and assumptions, which includes logic and not necessarily making it rule-based or form-based, which Lewis Carroll is playing with the forms of Aristotle and Boole and Mill and De Morgan, I argue. And that you can rethink everything in terms of whether or not it is useful, pragmatic, and utilitarian. In all of these subjects, you should rethink basic principles and assumptions based on the ongoing experience of their usefulness. Political laws, ethical morals, mathematical rules, and scientific understandings are to be continuously examined and developed such that they are best A, for the greatest number of people, and B, over the longest period of time. It is wise and best to take the social view and the long view. As Mill himself argues, if Epicurus was saying, let's all eat chocolate until we die right now, that would be horrible. But if you are trying to give people enough good chocolate to make them happy, but not so much, you would be taking the view of the most people, not just you stuffing your own belly, and for the long period of time. As I do mention to my students, unfortunately, if many people talk about all of this as if, so you're saying we should just bliss out on heroin right the heck now and lose it, and that is clearly not taking the social and the long-term view, and that's all I'll say, thankfully, about that. Unfortunately, these are, of course, the problems of our lives. Neo-Confucians of the Song Dynasty debated about whether or not treating others the way you want to be treated and not treating others the way you don't want to be treated, the two sides of the golden rule found across human cultures in ethical discussions as if it is a continuous problem, is that they distinguish between these. The difference between Bentham and Mill reflects these positive and negative sides, in fact, and also parallels proactive socialism that comes into your life to help you and laissez-faire capitalism that stays out of your life to stay out of your way and your unbridled success. Bentham argued that we should maximize happiness and do things for others we want done for us, such as collecting taxes from everyone to provide education for everyone, whether or not they can afford it. Mill, who is quite influential in American law and legal theory, in fact, argued that we should minimize pain, first and foremost, before maximizing pleasure, which is laissez-faire very much, and kind of libertine in a more American way, doing things for others only when they prevent harm, and otherwise leaving individuals free. So we don't make you the government breakfast, and we only send the cops when somebody's about to die. Consider that in Denmark, which is more socialist in many ways than America, quite openly, there are places funded by taxes. There were years ago, and Vice did an amazing piece on it, and I bring it up as an excellent example of politics and ethics for my students all the time, because it pushes, I am from Berkeley town, so it's good to give people extreme examples, and an example that would be too extreme for many Americans, but many lefties would consider, is that there are places in Denmark where alcoholics can go and sign over their state welfare check if they are struggling and have a state welfare check, and the state steadily takes care of you, does not mandate that you continue drinking at all or force you to stay there, and has other facilities for you to transition to. But if you cannot get off of alcohol, they provide you a place to live such that you're not homeless in the street, and many of people thus slowly drink themselves to death, somewhat on the state and everyone's dole. Now, Americans would find this very terrible, but I grew up in the Haight-Ashbury. There's a lot of homelessness there, and while many would blame the hate and other practices for that, many people chase the homeless out of their areas, and they come to where it is, well, nicer but not so nice anywhere for homeless folks. So Whether or not to have places where people can know where their uncle is drinking himself to death or not, paid for by taxes and welfare, is a very extreme example of what many Americans would just find to be outright, again, utter socialism and something not American plenty. So, with all of that, and again, not going to sit and argue one way or the other on that, but that is a good example of all of that. I have ethical videos on that. Let us move now, after that intro on Mill's thought, to Mill on logic and mathematics. So in the text Logic and Mathematics, Mill asks, if we admit that all is induction as empiricists, then why do we say there are, quote, exact sciences, end quote, when nothing is ideal or exact, not in any field? We similarly say, this is the 1800s, by the way, we similarly say there are hard sciences, such as math and physics. Mill argues this is an illusion due to the fact that objects of math are conceptions and thus imaginary. Hence, they have perfect straight edges like an ideally straight line. There is a joke I always love to mention is supposedly if you talk to an engineer, they say one thing, you talk to a chemist, they say another thing, then you talk to the physicist, who's more the theorist, and he says, well, let's assume your cow is perfectly spherical. It's the, you ask these people to build a barn for you and a barn door, and the physicist says, okay, let's assume a perfectly, aerodynamic spherical cow. Ideally so, is the joke. So, some, such as Russell, now Russell is an opponent of Mill, and he is one of the early positivist proto-analytic thinkers. So Russell says, without perfection of a sort, there is no math, science, or knowledge possible. Mill argues this is silly, as we have these things, yet do not have an instance of a perfectly straight line in the world. Our concept of a straight line is useful, even if it is ideal. One of the interesting things here to think is, when you see a straight line in your head, how do you know it's a perfectly straight line? I think the correct answer would actually be Wittgenstein's. Would suggest in his later work, you can't know that the line in your head is a perfectly straight line because you have nothing to compare it to in a process. You could trust it against a standard. We could become cybernetic organisms such that we practice imagining straight lines and measure it against straight lines someday in the future. We have nothing like that now. And so as of now, you would imagine a line that appears straight to you and have absolutely no way of knowing every little last pixel. Are they pixelated? I don't think so. You wouldn't know. Again, in fact, a pixelated line on a screen is not a perfectly straight line. It's all broken up, etc. But you know what? Let's just not pretend I know too much about pixels or the real world. Russell argued that we can strip down or whittle to the pure straight-edge truth, objectivity beyond subjectivity. But Mill, against this, very much like skeptical thought, mixing subjectivity and objectivity, emotions for Carroll and other things, and math, poetry and mathematician for Poe, Mill argues that this merely helps us, whittling down to objectivity from the subjective, to focus our observation and thinking, but it does nothing to guarantee that our knowledge is certain at all. We can ignore aspects of a thing to focus on particular aspects or parts, but this does not completely take these factors out of the picture, even as far as relevance to the parts that are in focus. Like Kant, Russell wanted to found science on a first principle, the principle of non-contradiction, a la Leibniz and Kant. But Mill argues this and the principle of bivalence are in fact general observations acquired from practice. We can see that belief and disbelief oppose one another. We have emotional states in our head that are opposed to this or that. That they are oppositional mental states, as Mill says. Now, I think the Queens in Alice in Wonderland could even be compared to something like oppositional mental states in Alice if you look at their positioning to Alice in the ending images, but I'll mention that with Alice and through the looking glass, which is where all that comes about. I think Mill's sums that he is going to talk about here are very much what the Queens tell Alice with the dog, and if you take the bone away, the dog's temper is left over. But I will talk through this right now. So we can see that opposing stories often but not always lead us to see that someone is mistaken or lying, but not that contradictions always mean one side's right and the other side is wrong completely, as if it is the wrong mathematical answer and all answers are mathematical and formal. Mill argues that the two principles, the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of bivalence, which are still considered quite important to anything like objective-seeking analytic philosophy, the two principles, which is highly still neo-Kantian, that the two principles are merely useful generalizations, as are all concepts used by human beings, whether scientists, philosophers, or common folk. Henry Siddwick, who was a author that Carroll owned on his shelf about fallacies. Siddwick wrote several days after Mill's death that Mill's influence had been declining lately because of his radical politics and interest passing on to other later thinkers. But, he says, and this is very important for Carroll, between 1860 and 1865, those just happened to be the years Lewis Carroll was writing Alice in Wonderland in particular, thinking of, through 54, I believe, up to 65, thinking of and composing bits of the pieces, talking to children, teaching children math and logic. But 1860 to 1865 are the years of the most formative years to the writing of Alice in Wonderland. Siddwick says Mill's philosophy between 1860 and 1865 ruled English thought as few have, and Siddwick didn't think he'd ever see anything like it again. Siddwick even said Mill will have to be destroyed, but that, quote, when he is destroyed, we shall have to build him a mausoleum as big as his present temple of fame, end quote. Now, my point with Carroll is only that he is contesting with Mill and is much like him, but not. My overall argument with Carroll is that Carroll is wrestling with Aristotle and trying to figure out what he wants to preserve and teach of Aristotle, while wrestling with his own ideas of what could be or not good in a modern form of logic, like Mill, Boole, and De Morgan. De Morgan's son built Lewis Carroll a fireplace with tiles with animals on them, or at least made the tiles, painted the tiles. So, with all that, these are all the figures of logic that Lewis Carroll is reading as he composes Wonderland. So, Balfour wrote that Mill presided over English universities much as Hegel did Germany and Aristotle in the Middle Ages, which means Lewis Carroll certainly knew of the guy as he was at the most prestigious of them at Oxford. In reaction to Mill, first British idealism took hold, led by T.H. Green, and then Frege Russell and the Vienna Circle, who called Kant's a priori categories the analytic, founded logical positivism, the close ancestor of modern analytic philosophy, which still dominates the Anglophonic world and its universities. From the time of the First World War to the liberation politics of the 1960s, utilitarianism was roasted for logical errors at universities, and Mill's empirical take on logic and mathematics was something serious empiricists were taught to avoid. I will basically say Lewis Carroll seems to have a love-hate relationship with Aristotle, Boole. He doesn't particularly like Boole, I'd say. I think he likes and does not like much of Mill, and Lewis Carroll himself mocks utilitarianism in ways, but not entirely. I think he is very much, as the White Knight sings, on the fence between them, and I think there's plenty of evidence I will get to with Carroll with that. Mill's naturalism assumes ethical and epistemological objectivity. That there are things that are objectively good or right. But Mill and his tutor Bentham share much with Hume, and Bentham said Hume led him to understand the normal and the factual, the normative and the factual, the way that our practices and customs become what is objectively certain for us. Hume famously said, truth is assumption, habit, and prejudice, which is very Mill and utilitarian and quite pragmatism, especially at its most skeptical in America. Mill wrote, the most scientific proceeding can be no more than an improved form of that which was primitively pursued by human understanding while undirected by science. I agree with this completely. I think human reasoning was formed long before literacy, mostly. I'm perfectly open to what, but science and literacy would not have brought basic logic to humanity and the human brain. That would be putting the cart well before, the actual living horse. And so I have to agree with Mill, and I am still struck by how much people think logic came along with civilization or literacy rather than the evolution of the brain. But I have to say, Mill, around about the time of Darwin, in fact, from 1860 to 65, as Darwin is catching on in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, at least 50s and 60s. I have to agree here completely. Mill also says, quote, the laws of our rational faculty, like those of every other natural agency, are only learned by seeing the agent at work, end quote. I agree with that completely. Wittgenstein says it's only when you see the machine break down that you learn how the parts work, and you only learn how human logic works when you see imperfect situational human thought, not pure formal rules of math or logic, mathematical logic, but that is my preferences, and it does happen to be in line with Mill's, and I think Carroll was wrestling with how much to make logic mathematical like Boole, or leave it situational in time and space with Mill, and also Aristotle. Mill argues that primitive normative dispositions are based on one sort, enumerative induction, and with accepting past statements based on memory or not, Mill builds his science, his science of inductive logic and mathematics. In his system of logic, the disposition that is primitively normative is generalization from experience. Who's heard of that? Not me. Deductive principles of reasoning are justified inductively, and the inductive process self-stabilizes, Mill argues. I have students who still say Mills, thinking General Mills. I correct them nicely if I do. It self-stabilizes. As we learn and scrape together what we assume, our assumptions, very Hume, self-stabilize, confirm, extend, refine, rather than undermine themselves. Mill rejects the idea that there are simply intuitive beliefs because, like Hegel, he argues we must know where the belief comes from, not just that we simply have it. For Mill, there is only happiness which is underived and not for any particular reason. The most influential Kantian counterattack was Frege in 1884. Now, this is very important for framing human thought objective-subjective, because pragmatism and utilitarianism are seen as leaning pro-science, but too much on the side of humanity is fluid and doesn't perfectly have form. And folks who want form and formal logic, and Kant, neo-Kantianism, continued, like Frege in 1884, have particular scorn for Mill and utilitarianism in Britain and pragmatism in America. Frege particularly attacked Mill. He turned his back on one of Mill's central concerns. How do we get mathematical knowledge in the first place? Evolution! I still have to say here, it has struck me continuously that analytic philosophy is really unconcerned with how logic evolved in tribes or historically. It is much more concerned with, we have these rules, let's assume we sort of have them, without showing how these things could have arisen. And when you have a thinker like Hume, my apologies, when you have a thinker like Hegel, who wants to see things in time, analytic philosophy really does not like dealing with time or society as much as mathematical principles. So Frege says we just have to say mathematical principles are here. We're not going to discuss how that could arise at all. And he says this, again, in the wake of Mill and Darwin, I would say somewhat pro-Kant and anti-Hegel and process of society and time. Frege is himself Germanic, yes? Frege simply says, they are a priori analytic and the laws of logic are, quote, boundary stones set in an eternal foundation which our thought can overflow but never displace, end quote. Frege wrote that we cannot explain and must accept logical laws. We cannot explain. Which again, as many people said in the 70s, actually, analytic philosophy is based on things that are not scientifically provable and then believe science proves everything, but can't prove that, as many people have wrestled with. Is objective thought itself an objective view? Well, the laws of logic are just there. Our thought can overflow them but never displace them, which is odd. These back and forth, this is one of the problems with this kind of thinking. There are inviolable laws of logic if we stick to them, but then we can flow past them perhaps if we're more emotional and throwing a hissy fit. But how do we flow past the rigid set bounds of logic if they're rigid and set? This, again, does not make much sense with practice because it is all too ideal, according to me, and that would also be Mill. Frege wrote that we cannot explain and must accept logical laws, such as identity, unless we wish to reduce our thought to confusion and finally renounce all judgment whatsoever. That's very much Russell says, well, Mill says, let's suspect everything. Well, I can't suspect whether or not I had coffee this morning. That'll just throw everything into confusion. And Mill and the pragmatist would say, but I'm trying to think things fruitfully, not question things in rash, foolish ways, because assumptions, but again, what you do find is more dogmatic, objective-based thinking, I would say, across human cultures. That's a little Hegel, but that is my own searchings into India, China, etc. You tend to find that skeptics and people into subjectivity say, well, those people are too skeptical to come up with anything, but then you find the objective dogmatic types say a skepticism will reduce all our thinking to ashes. We won't be able to judge or think, as if people have ever had any problem judging others, as if they've ever had any problem chattering to themselves and thinking. But you continuously hear, unless we believe in objectivity and or science and or literacy, everything will fall apart. People say this continuously past several civilizations and continuously through them. I have to say, Frege is not alone in this. Although I find him far from ideal. honestly, which is why I'm picking at it. So, Frege argues that our confusion itself isn't a logical consequence, so it is not a logical reason to accept laws of logic, only the ways we take things to be logical. Once again, I do find people who believe in objectivity tend to assume it first and foremost and never prove it, which is fine, and the proof is because the other side would lead to ruin. Criticizing the first positivists, as Frege came after, Mill scathingly says Comte, he would not have known of Frege, Mill wouldn't, Mill says Comte, the French positivist, is obsessed with consensus and made no room for diversity or the individual, much as Mill thought of Bentham's proactive communal society. Mill argued conflict and opposition in ideas is a precondition for the progress of society. Mill wrote Comte's golden rule is to live for others, to be altruistic. It's possible Comte coined the term altruism, which again for the Americans looks like altruisme with an E on the end, and yet isn't. Comte said that everything should be moral and the same for all, but society is not a single system for a single end, according to Mill. He would have seen Bentham and Comte arguing everybody gets the same lunch, that's best, and Mill believes in a bit laissez-faire, let others make their own lunch and make sure they don't get hurt before they get to the, before they get out there to get their lunch, or as they're getting it, which is a bit more capitalistic, again, and laissez-faire with it. That it makes everyone happier, Mill argues, to pursue their own happiness. You will hear politicians, of course, going back and forth about very much exactly this today. Mill wrote, the regimen of a blockaded town should be clearly submitted to when high purpose requires it. But is it the ideal perfection of human existence? What that means, of course, is dogmatic thinking and adhering to principles and saying we have to have principles and rules. That's great when you absolutely have to, but you shouldn't blockade your town and close up your mind when you don't have to have rigid rules and principles. And I would say what Mill would say about Frege's words, as I said, I believe, I'm not misrepresenting him, is that Frege demands there to be mathematical rules, and he cannot show there is. In fact, he absolves himself of the responsibility to show there's any mathematical rules or proof of them. He says this cannot be proved, which would make it it would make it unscientific, but certainly impossible to be scientific because it would be unverifiable. Unfortunately, analytic philosophy believes so much in science and objectivity, they believe in verification very firmly, so that would take a lot of the basics of analytic philosophy for many completely out of analysis and confirmation by scientific methods or any others, precluding them from the outset. Mill's system of logic is meant to fully codify the methods of induction, which he didn't, I must say. The justification of logic in math is ultimately inductive for him. Mill says the principle of exclusion is one of our first and foremost familiar generalizations from experience. Mill argues arithmetic develops from rearranging pebbles and other ordinary objects such that we can arrange them different ways such that one order isn't another and back again. Here, time can reverse, he says. This is very interesting. Many would say, no, it's physically, like time never reverses. In a certain sense, I don't want to get into a debate, about entropy, etc. This may be human beings perceiving time going in a line where we can't necessarily see time in a line or not going one direction. And let me just say, we can reverse situations in time. Not all of them. And yes, you mix up sand, perhaps not. I've seen video, of course, there's images on Reddit of people unmixing types of sand with tweezers, and actually pretending to at least or faking it. You can actually reverse processes in time, many of them from our own perspective. It's just many would, again, declare strangely with physics or what have you, that in many circumstances you can't, therefore all not. But arrangements can be put back the way they were with pebbles, vice versa, yes, and that would be necessary for math. If you couldn't put pebbles in different groups and back into the same groups you did before, math would not be reversible in the ways it is, ideally so, if we do suggest math is in fact ideal at all, which Mill need not here. So unlike mixtures of chemicals, again, some may argue entropy shows that with chemicals time is irreversible completely. I will not enter into a serious, argument that this is one way or the other. But I do like to point out with Mill, no, there are and aren't reversible arrangements of things. It isn't that every arrangement we see is irreversible, like the movie, I guess. We have one sensation and then another, with the two different sensations identified and conceptualized as a constant number of pebbles, where quantity comes from in basic experience. Don't watch Indivisible, by the way, unless you're into French things more than they are, I would say. So as Mill says, the definition of 3 as 2 and 1 together is this sort of basic arrangement, that it's reversible back and forth. Far from ideal, unlike the French and myself. This strikes us in two ways, as something you can compose and decompose continuously. Now, Mill emphasizes processes of joining and separating. The queens in Alice in Wonderland seem to show us what Mill is talking about, and it seems to me that Carol is a bit siding with Mill. Not entirely, but with the Queens of Alice, I will suggest, if you look at the sums they're suggesting to Alice, they are far more Mill than Boole. And I will do Boole next, and then De Morgan to show. And then more about Alice and Carol. Mill emphasizes processes of joining and separating, giving rise to aggregates, another word for set or group, as we put them together or withdraw portions of them. And we can reproduce aggregates by reversing the process. Thus, bringing two things or three things together is making two or three, or separating one thing off from the group is making one. I like these words. It is very much in trying to figure out how our brains conceptualize and draw boundaries around things. We make things into one or two or three as we arrange them into the quantitative groups they are as we experience it. Now, again, if we want to say there's just hard objective truth, the tree falls in the forest when we're not there, we could say the quantities are there before we know it. But when you look at a tree, as I always like to say, and you don't know whether it has 64 or 63 leaves and you look at it, you need not subconsciously know it's 64, 63, or any quantity at all. As you look at a tree, you need not think quantitatively all the time. Number words may have come along. I love Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. Number words may have come along recently in human history, along with civilization more so, at least, which means we've only been making one, two, or three out of groups on purpose for any purposes at all, probably specialized civilized activities first and foremost, and also writing things down would help spread number words or make them useful, and taking records. If we aren't really making one, making two, or making three, it's arguable humanity is not aware of or have quantities very much in reality at all. How much have you been thinking quantities over much of what I've been saying? Has it secretly been quantized in your brain in ways you're not talking out? And if not, certainly I've been saying some number of words, but not a particular number to you, consciously or subconsciously necessarily. It'd be odd if our brain knew there's 64 leaves on the tree, counted them, and didn't tell us. That'd be very strange, especially if it did it before humanity started using number words. I'd say even, around the time of literacy, but we don't know these things, I'd say. Also experts seem to say that. So it does fascinate me with Late Wittgenstein and that kind of view, how we make one, two, or three with number words in the world as objective, subjective, duck-rabbit truth. That is a very important issue. Mill is on this in a way that Wittgenstein is very much, but is his own duck-rabbit, yes? So, at the end of Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, the second and last of the two books about Alice, the queens sit on either side of Alice. I do think we can look at them as opposing mental states. The white queen is very inclusive. I believe that Mill is trying to represent the four corners of Aristotle's square of opposition and other logical teachings in the Alice works. So, the white queen is inclusive and childlike. The red queen is exclusive and governess-like and adult-like. They're extreme for Aristotle's ethics. One is too extreme over this way, the other is too extreme over that way. Too child, too adult governess. White and red are also very Aristotle colors for emotion and temperance. And in that, they seem like they are asking they're asking Alice, Carol's character, not Carol himself, of course, that'd be strange, to do sums with basic objects in the ways humanity probably did things before we used number words as sums, adding and dividing, which is what Mill argues in his works that Carroll owned, that actually mathematics comes from primitive practices of adding and dividing groups, and that is what the queens ask Alice as a child to do, as Lewis is teaching children, I would argue, logic, Aristotelian logic, and screwing with Boole and De Morgan as he works through his fictional works for children. At least to familiarize children with the basic goods and bads of the pieces, if not being explicit about logic for us or the children or others. So the queens sit on either side of Alice, a pawn who now has the chance at the end of the board to become a queen herself, and they ask her strange sums, such as what results when you take a bone away from a dog. When Alice doesn't answer, the answer, they say, is the dog's temper is the result left over from this strange subtraction. The queens shake their heads and say Alice can't do sums a bit. Alice, growing into an adult, is asked to gather and divide the way others do, which is strangely mathematical. Mill's empiricism rejects both Kant's synthetic a priori and analytic a priori, the idea that we have basic concepts through experience of our minds. Mill argues that scientific definitions serve as landmarks, much as Frege later says logic is like boundary stones. But Mill's are conventions that could change, while Frege's boundary stones are set in stone. Yeah? Not by humanity, but by the mind, which we can then overshoot with our own minds. I guess emotion gets involved suddenly with logic, as opposed to it being pure words. Emotive enters the picture, as Poe says, everything goes to heck, don't it, with the apes. So, by the mind, a priori, beyond convention or experience. So, Mill is arguing, no, we don't have concepts set in stone, but our minds groove things out into what they become. But they're not set there, and is more the tabula rasa Lockean than Kant. Mill argues that classifications and definitions in science change, using the examples of redefining the term acid after the discovery of hydrochloric acid, HCl, what Mill calls muriatic acid at the time, because it, unlike acids previously studied, doesn't combine with alkalis to form salts or contain oxygen, which scientists thought all acids did at the time, and defined them so, and then were wrong. Because induction to deduction, as Mill says, first and foremost. Quine, who balances between positivism and pragmatism, makes a similar point at the end of his influential Two Dogmas of Empiricism in 1951, the year Wittgenstein died, in fact, I believe. That definitions can always be redefined with new discoveries, so any definition can be taken as basic to thought, as if it is set in stone in the basic frame of analysis, thus analytic, until we reframe things. Like Kant, Mill doesn't say what the conditions for legitimate definitions are, but both suggest that the language should pick out the language, or all of them, should pick out objects in the world, and clearly I use language well. Like Avicenna argues with unicorns, Mill argues that centaurs are not real. This is very similar to Avicenna, the greatest of Islamic philosophers who influence Europeans, and then they don't talk about it much, but still he has his influence and connections. Mill argues centaurs, like unicorns, are not real, so the word refers to imaginary objects of mind that do mean something, but that don't apply to actual objects as the word horse does. That is what Avicenna argues. Your concept of horse does apply. What Avicenna argues is, and it's very in tune with Mill and British empiricism, Carroll, and imagination, and the emphasis on imagination. My videos on Islamic logic emphasize the place imagination has in Islamic thought, and they are increasingly seeing how imagination can lead 1001 Arabian Nights to all sorts of interesting thinking and prophecy and scientific theory and mathematics. That Avicenna says a unicorn is imaginary, your concept of a unicorn is imaginary, your concept of a horse is imaginary, but your concept of a horse and the image of a horse and the word horse, your whole concept mentally, applies to actual horses in the physical world, but your concept and your equally imaginary concept of unicorns does not, as anybody who's knowing and not ignorant knows, does not apply to real objects as unicorns in the world. So actually, Avicenna is arguing all concepts are imaginary, whether or not they apply and hook up to correspond, as some might say, to the real world and to actual objects. The set having members, as one could say. So, ideal triangles, which no triangles perfectly are, similarly imaginary things, though certainly triangle-like triangles are plenty everywhere. We can see triangles everywhere, perhaps not perfect ones ever. However, against Whewell and his followers, I don't know, I was not there at the time, Mill argued that parallel lines do not enclose a space, not because of rational projections along axioms, but because we do not experience them as we draw them out enclosing the space. They actually endlessly go on open, don't they? Parallel lines. They don't close at the end. It's actually an infinite amount of space not being bound at all, you know? It sort of is, again. It depends, kind of. Finding these efforts at following patterns frustrated an experience again and again. Properties are found in actual objects, not abstractions of pure mind or reason, Mill argues against Kant. Mill does not show, however, how advancements in his own time can be legitimated. He makes all of these observations. I think this is very much in the background of Carroll's thinking. It was popular in Carroll's day as he composed Wonderland. Carroll owns several of these works of Mill that mention these ideas, and he seems to be playing with these ideas in Wonderland and then The Looking Glass, and I would say The Snark in his other work. But Mill did not present a systematic logic the way that Boole and De Morgan were trying to come up with forms that extended the forms of Aristotle. Mill shies away from that, so Carroll certainly does, I would say, share Mill's views somewhat, but he is playing with the formal rules of Aristotle and Boole and De Morgan to figure out, Carroll was, how much of that he himself wanted to argue for and thought was legitimate in human thought and reasoning. That does seem to me quite clear in the reading of all these texts. So Mill falls back without being systematic on any way of gathering and dividing, and that's math forms with no other basic structures. Now that's fine enough, but folks like Frege would want basic rules, and I don't think, and Wittgenstein in his later work doesn't think they get them. But we sort of want the basics, and yet we are fluid with them, and this creates endless problems still in understanding thought, logic, and psychology. German logicians, culminating in Frege, made advancements with symbolic logic that Mill's simple basis does not enlighten much at all, which is why Frege and others before him resulted in set theory, in theoretical relationships between abstract sets, to account for how mathematics had evolved in super-algebraic ways, from algebra to calculus to Boolean operations, and then after Frege, Wittgenstein's truth tables, which is a very powerful, useful way of arranging these sets visually, like Venn diagrams were for Aristotle's syllogisms in Carroll's own day. These give us abstract ways of gathering and dividing things, as Mill says, but ways that vastly outpower physical gathering and dividing, such as considering the group of all horses with 3 legs throughout the universe and history, or all democratic presidents, or any other things it would be physically impossible to collect into a single room. Does this show Mill is wrong or super right, more than he could know before Frege's set theory? Debate rages on. Philip Kitcher argues that while discussing Mill, that mathematicians are more into a priori forms than most who claim scientific and objective knowledge, because mathematicians do not do experiments. In a sense they do, but they do not do experiments in other fields like other fields, and test against the objects of math per se as they behave in the world themselves, perhaps. It's arguable they may or may not. And so, Kitcher argues, rely on the felt necessity of mathematics, that a symbolic manipulation or mathematical operation can be used in the way it must be. Oddly, this would imply that we do arithmetic regularly, not because we can't do it another way, but we feel we must do math the way it is done by others. I think that is correct. We are afraid of contradicting others, and so we do math regularly, which sounds weird, but that's all human behavior, including mathematics, and we might not have rules or practices of math that regularly work without that being motivated and emotional, and part of human behaviors. We could take one away as a type of tax for practical purposes, such that 1 equals nothing, 1 plus 1 equals nothing. Or 1 equals nothing, 1 plus 1 equals 1, as it is also for Boolean algebra, in which true and true is true by way of the logical connective and in 2 values, 1 as true and 0 as false. In such deviant mathematical practices, 2 and 3 make 4, which we can do, and adjust to such that it feels we must do things this way, and to fit the pattern and make the system work as it does for everyone, but there is something in taking one away that can feel wrong, whether or not this feeling is based on prior forms set in the mind before any experience, or posterior forms learned through experience and practice are there. Mill does say, mathematics is the language of nature, as if we feel it more than other things as basic quite naturally through experience. But the feeling of necessity is an illusion, particularly felt about mathematics, that makes them feel particularly certain, and they are consistently confirmed by experience, with 2 and 3 constantly making 5 and not other things, neither 4 nor zebras. Whewell argued that a proposition must be false if it is inconceivable that it is true. Mill points out that this shows we are certain in what we imagine to be true. Channeling his fellow British empiricist Hume, Mill wrote, "Now I cannot wonder that so much stress should be laid on the circumstances of inconceivableness." Inconceivable! You've bested my Spaniard. When there is such ample experience to show that our capacity or incapacity of conceiving a thing has very little to do with the possibility of the thing in itself, it's our ignorance, rather, but it is in truth very much an affair of accident, what we're aware of, and depends on the past history and habits of our minds. There is no more generally acknowledged fact in human nature than the extreme difficulty at first felt in conceiving anything as possible, which is in contradiction to long-established and familiar experience, or even to old familiar habits of thought. That would be Mill saying we don't have to stick to any rules of anything, including math and logic. Mill argues that the history of science is full of examples of traditional beliefs that were mistakenly thought to be true because everything else was inconceivable, anything else than that, and it was only experience that surprised the believers and revised the beliefs. This reminds us of the Princess Bride, again, inconceivable, and I do not think it means what you think it means, says the Spaniard. Derrida, the later postmodern French philosopher, says the impossible becomes possible all the time, and he fixates on that a bit. Mill shows Whewell himself admits our ancestors thought many things inconceivable. I tell my students all the time, flying through the sky was thought by the Army to be wrong. When the Wright brothers first telegraphed the U.S. Army, it took the U.S. Army 3 to 4 years to believe the Wright brothers, because the U.S. Army, before the Air Force was possible, thought the Wright brothers were con men and must be lying. This was before the internet as well. Because it was inconceivable humans can fly. No, you can't, stupid. What are you, Icarus? No, and he can't, really. Not that well, anyways. Not in the long run. So, well, it's not a run, but you get it. You got to run up to it. So Mill says it is right to imagine what we think is impossible and say it isn't the case, but we can see that this is imaginary, what we imagine and think, and not necessarily what is necessarily the case or impossibly not the case. This is fine for Mill because we constantly have our beliefs confirmed in experience, so we are not left in an existential long night of doubt with Kierkegaard or Sartre, as Russell says, continuously asking ourselves if we drank coffee this morning and not getting any mathematics done, because Mill wrote several works. Mill suggests our failures of imagination shouldn't be taken too seriously. I agree. Or any of these figures. Like Quine later, he sees the inability to imagine breakdowns in arithmetic and felt necessity to be akin to pre-Copernicans, saying the earth can't move. Or like Aristotle, who argued the earth can't move. Or pre-Newtonians, that there can't be action at a distance without contact of some visible kind, such as gravity, an invisible force that can affect two objects at a great distance, as pre-Newtonians argued. Each exhibit in the Exploratorium, I love the Exploratorium of the Bay and San Francisco, yay, Bay, Aryan Nation. Each exhibit in the Exploratorium, which is a science museum that I loved as a kid, if you have never been, and is wonderful, it says it's all sorts of strange things that look right in front of your face like they shouldn't happen. A lot of optical illusions. Wittgenstein loves optical illusions. I've loved them since I'm a kid. I'm still a kid, I guess. Never left. And it says what's going on each of the little things. And it's like, well, this is why in physics and this and that. And so I do like that, and I tell my students all the time, what's going on? And they're like, oh, the Exploratorium. And they know that from like field trips as children and such in the Bay here. Because at some point, every elementary class goes to the Exploratorium a lot. I hope still, in spite of budget cuts or what have you. So given all of that and rising ticket prices and everything, much love, to all the folks at the Exploratorium and public schools and everyone. So, yeah, what's going on? And of course, we're like, that's impossible. Well, the Exploratorium is a wonderful impossible science museum for you to figure out what's actually possible right in front of your face. Mill says a satisfactory explanation, scientific or otherwise, is a structure of proportions, of propositions that expresses relevant causal relationships. An explanation is a series of worded statements, which are also meaningful ideas that point out particular things and how they interact that is useful to us, relevant to our purpose and our situation and context. An explanation does not point out everything that exists, Mill argues, which would be a meaningless act. This is very much Thomas Kuhn and also Wittgenstein. Like suggesting someone do everything is a meaningless utterance, unless you are using it as a philosophical example of a meaningless utterance, which I happen to give several. An explanation does not point out what is useful or important universally either. Rather, explanations are contextual and situational. This is very late Wittgenstein. And we mistakenly imagine and demand that they be universal rather than general or particular, about most things or some things here or there, but not everything. What Wittgenstein very much argues in his later work is, there need not be a pure objective truth as much as there are practices which have to have wrongs and rights that are generally agreed upon. As long as there's that, there need not be perfect words or ideal descriptions at all, because as long as practices would need to be repeated and they would need to have success and failure often somewhat be identified regularly, but not always and not perfectly. And as long as you have that, you can have practices in logic and math. You don't need to ever have this type of addition no one ever makes a mistake on in practice. You don't ever have to say no one could mistake 4 and 5 to be anything other than 9, because they do. They make mistakes. So what you do is you have regular practices that often result in things that can clearly be seen as successes and failures, and that is all that's required for something in later Wittgenstein. And I agree with that, and that is exactly very much what Mill is talking about here. Mill gives the example that we notice all men die if they drink more than the smallest bit of arsenious acid. He thinks a lot about acid before the 60s, I gotta tell you. Yeesh. Wasn't there, man. So we can consider it a poison to most solidly and justifiably, as it is confirmed in general experience. For a political philosopher whose libertine ideas were dangerously in fashion in the 1960s, again, women's lib and such, Mill again has odd words here. We now have to explain why acid is poisonous to everyone so far, and Mill's explanation is, as far as science of his day knew, that acid comes into contact with cells and prevents them from decomposing as they naturally do, which are not our current explanations to my knowledge, and I'm not the expert here. He actually says this is my best suspicion, and he's wrong, actually, in current words, but that was as best as anyone knew, as best as he could figure it out from the experts of his time. They were consistent and practical in Mill's time for their purposes as they understood them. The science Mill engaged in most was botany in France, which he studied firsthand. William Whewell was the greatest English historian and philosopher of science of Mill's time, one who knew far more about the history and philosophy of science than Mill himself, and master of Trinity College, Cambridge, where Wittgenstein would later live and work with Bertrand Russell. Sidney Smith, the reverend with revered wit, who once joked that his friend thought Christian heaven is eating foie gras to the sound of trumpets, said about Whewell, science is his forte, omniscience is his foible. Whewell took the Kantian tack that there must be basic categories of understanding connecting to sensation for there to be knowledge produced at all. Mill drew on Whewell's work in history of science while arguing against him overall, writing that German idealism, the a priori view of basic human understanding inspired by Kant, is an enemy to British empiricism. These are very much the dueling forces of Wittgenstein and still modern philosophy and thought. Kantian German idealism versus British most outlying Hume empiricism. The a posteriori view that all knowledge comes from experience, the latter, versus it is somewhat rule-based, set in stone in ways in the former. Oddly, this would mean Mill would have thought Russell, who called himself an empiricist by name, was actually betraying empiricism and scientific inquiry, betraying his fellow Brits by following the Germans too much. Russell, who hated Hegel, would have found that very interesting. But Russell followed Kant's idealistic insistence on basic unchanging underlying mental structures more than anything like British empiricism of Locke and Hume. Mill argued that such a Kantian position was incapable of explaining scientific objectivity. Frege says so. He agrees, poorly, wrongly I'd say, as in he should think something else, as the categories cannot be explained as caused over time if they are simply given and immutable, just as Hegel had argued against Kant, and that there is no way of validating them, of confirming them with new experience, or speaking correctly. If scientific objective knowledge is both explained in the past and confirmed in the future, Mill argues Kantian ideal categories cannot be considered scientific or objective, even if they are considered fixed and fundamental. Mill wrote against channeling Hume, there never was such an instrument devised for consecrating all deep-seated prejudices. Whewell and Mill wrote criticisms of each other back and forth over the years. Mill says the uniformity of the course of nature is the major premise of all induction, and the law of causation stands at the head of all observed uniformities, as an uncontradicted universal. A general that doesn't seem to be particular or qualified with counterexamples at all. Stuff tends to follow like stuff from stuff. We can conceive of everything dissolving into chaos, but this doesn't happen, as things seem to regularly cause other things and arise all around us. It is difficult to conceive of how we would have experience without having causation, causing a cat. Whether or not it is a principle constantly confirmed in countless ways that we consistently experience in ways that are quite general. With counterexamples, but not as equally as it seems experience and objects are quite regular. Apples are each individual, but we wouldn't often say each apple behaves as an individual, unique in its own way to the same extent. Identity is oddly irregular compared to causality, with objects considered and thought of as each individual compared to the regularity of causation in general, with objects thought to behave as most do. However, Mill thought reality is not only generally regular, not universally, but he also said that it is acceptable in popular talk to say nature is uniform, but this is not precise enough for philosophical explanations. We do not expect rain or clouds to ever be exactly the same, nor do we expect the same dreams every night. It's a great example. Mill wrote, the course of nature is not only uniform, it is also infinitely various. And the order of nature, as perceived at first glance, presents at every instance a chaos founded by another chaos. Anyone who wants to seek a general theory of science should explain how a chemist can discover a new substance that breaks the old expectations and theory and then know several new things about it from a single sample. We would be skeptical that generalities hold far from cases distant from those that are generalized. The law of causation is the axiom of induction for Mill. General uniformity is secondary to discovering uniformities that are particular in context. The most important of the experimental methods are those of agreement and difference. Those are very much the queens. agreeing like a child and following and disagreeing and stand up straight, no as the governess. The method of agreement is that if two things have a circumstance in common, something in a particular sort of situation, which is the same for both in that sort of situation, but not in others, for Mill this means that the similarity of the situation is the cause, most likely. Like Occam, this can be said to be a maxim, not an absolute rule, but something often the case, like the simplest explanation, like the similarity of situations and things. The method of difference would be the converse. If there are differences, and if the only perceivable difference is the difference of the situation, then whatever is different in this situation is the cause of the difference. And again, that is, we can assume and work forward for Mill. Mill's other methods derive from these two. This is the most formal Mill ever got, that there is gathering things together as type of sameness and dividing things as type of difference. Now, the reason that I have given so long a talk on Boole and labored these points is because I did need to talk through all of this to get to the view of Mill I want, which is that what Carroll seems to be doing as a very pragmatic utilitarian sort of addition and childlike sort of non-quantitative sums with Alice and the Queens and the end of Alice's adventures, I think that Mill's explanations here definitely line up enough with that more than other work I've reviewed. And again, that is likely not accidental, because Carroll is very well familiar with Mill, and Mill is having his heyday as Carroll is finalizing and writing the majority of Wonderland. So, as an example of this for Mill, if apples are red and pears are yellow unless there is a heat wave, and both grow green whenever there is a heat wave, then it is justifiable to assume and proceed as if there is something about heat waves that causes apples and pears to be similarly green and different from how they usually are, both methods together in concert. Because, of course, without a specific type of sameness, one could not have, conversely, on the opposite way and side, duck-rabbit style, some kind of difference, such that now there is a different sameness. So that is Boole, which is going to be not now, but this was Mill. So what I'm going to do next is actually De Morgan, who comes next in time. And after we do De Morgan, we're going to do Boole, and then I will do Carroll. And I have many videos to make about Carroll over the next couple of days. So much love, much happiness. Hopefully you found that enlightening, and I will follow with more talks on logic, De Morgan, Boole, and then Carroll and his work through Aristotle, Boole, the Mad Tea Party, and others. And I will, as usual, see ya, if I do indeed ever see ya.